Hey, Tyson here from Refuge Church in Lenoir City, Tennessee. Thank you for listening to our message today. Refuge Church is a family of faith sent to proclaim hope in Jesus Christ through relationships. For more resources and information about Refuge, please visit us on the web at refugeph.com.
All right, we have been talking about Jesus in the Old Testament. Today we're going to look at the Sabbath and what that means. But while you're getting ready for that, got a couple of announcements. We have ESL starting on August 16th. That's where we go to La Cruz Church in downtown Lenoir City, and we help teach English. It's really an outreach for that church to draw people in, and we partner with them. That's on Tuesday nights starting 8:16. We still need some volunteers for that. If you're willing to volunteer with that, see myself or Rodney or Martin or Austin. Also, Awana kicks off this Wednesday with a party. There's some flyers floating around here that look like this. Our Awana program is excellent. That's part of the revival that we have seen in our church comes through that Awana program and what they do. So we're going to have a huge slip and slide out here on the grass. So we want you to come prepared for that. But we also need a couple of volunteers. We're particularly looking for somebody to teach the 3 to 5 year olds. And we would prefer for that to be a male just because we need more male involvement. So you may say, hey, okay, I'm a male, but I don't want to teach. 3rd through 5th grade, sorry. I put 3 through 5 here. So 3rd through 5th grade. But you may say, okay, I'm a male, but I don't want to teach. We still want you involved, okay, because we need more males involved. We got a lot of women who volunteer. We need a couple of men who can volunteer. We've got some. We need a few more. But we need a teacher for that. Actually, the classroom part of that starts off on the 17th. So don't forget that. Also, I just want to mention this. Maybe you're here. You've been a Christian for a long time. You've never been baptized. I want you to consider that. I mean, ultimately, I talked about Nicole. She had been a Christian for a while, but had never been baptized. It's part of that being obedient. And sometimes making that step makes a huge difference. Maybe not just in your own life, but in the life of others. I know we've seen that really inside of her family and throughout. So maybe that's you. If you're a visitor with us, you can follow along by texting the word visit to 865-276-8686. Send some sermon notes. You can follow along. We're going to be all over the place today, so you're going to need those. But the verses will be on the screen. So we're going to talk about the Sabbath. Just a little bit of the history of the Sabbath. The Jews celebrate Sabbath on Saturday. When Jesus was crucified, he was hanging on the cross. They had to get him off the cross before the Sabbath, which started at sundown on Friday evening. That's the reason there was this whole debate about are they going to break his legs to get him to go ahead and die, all that stuff, but he was already dead. That was to get him off the cross because you can't handle a dead body on the Sabbath, so that's their Sabbath. There are people around who are Seventh-day Adventists. What they do is they celebrate the true Sabbath on Saturday. They have church on Saturday. We changed, Christians, evangelicals, changed the Sabbath to Sunday because that's when Jesus rose from the dead. The government couldn't decide which one was right, so we get a 2-day weekend. So I propose that we move Sabbath to the Monday, and let's just see what happens, okay? So the Sabbath, what is the deal with the Sabbath and why? We're going to look at God gives the nation of Israel these 10 commandments, and he really focuses in on commandment number 4, the Sabbath. And the consequences of breaking that law are pretty harsh. And we have to ask the question, well, why is he so hard line on the Sabbath that you shouldn't work on the Sabbath? You shouldn't do all these things on the Sabbath. Why is he taking that so hard? And we're going to look at that and see what it points to. Remember, all these things that we look at in the Old Testament, they point to something. And we're going to see what this points to. But before we do that, I want you to think about this. Jews today, and even Jews in Jesus' time, were trying to earn God's favor. They wanted to keep the law as best they could to try to earn God's favor. They felt like that they had earned what God had given them. They were children of Abraham. They'd been circumcised on the 8th day. We follow the law. You remember there's a guy who came and he asked Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he said, keep the law and the commandments. And he goes, all those things I have done. So that's the way Jews looked at it, is that they sort of deserved God's favor because they pray 3 times a day, they tithe, they do the atonement sacrifices, all these things that God had set up for them. They felt like that they had sort of earned God's favor. Well, the truth of the matter is we can fall into that same trap. And here's what that trap may look like for us as Christians is maybe there's something going on in our life and we need God to answer a prayer. So sometimes we make deals with God. God, if you'll answer this prayer, I'll do X. You know, when I was in college, it was like, if you help me pass this test, I'll do this. I'll serve you for the rest of my life. Well, here I am. No. But we make those deals, right? We make these deals when you really, instead of praying, maybe you should be studying for your test. I'm just saying. But here's the thing. We make these deals with God like we want to earn his favor. And sometimes we think the opposite of that's true, that when bad things happen to us, we think, well, maybe I did something wrong. Or maybe earning God's favor looks like this. I know that I went to school with this lady. She posted this on Facebook one time. She goes, I feel like getting to heaven is like doing more good than I do bad. Well, in a sense, that's earning God's favor. We feel like there's this scale of justice, if you will, that if we do more good over here than we do bad, then God will love us and God will get us into heaven. Like we got, if we flip somebody off over here going down the road, we got to help an old lady across the street over here to sort of balance that out, right? So we don't really know what the scale is. We just try to miss on that side. But in the same way, we laugh at that, but there's a lot of people who believe that. There's a lot of people that feel that we have to earn God's favor. Well, I want us to look at that today as we look at this fourth commandment. So we're going to pick it up in Exodus chapter 31. It says, and the Lord said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths. For this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. Now, a couple of things jump out here. Above all, you know, do not murder. Yeah, above that. You should have no other gods before me. Yeah, above all. Right? He's really trying to get us to focus on this commandment here. And he says, listen, it has a purpose. You shall keep my Sabbaths, and that it may sanctify you. Look at that last phrase in that passage. It's for you. Sanctify means to set apart or to prepare and to make it sacred. God's trying to do something in us with the Sabbath. So I want us to understand that this is about us. Look at verse 14. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. Again, we see here, it's for you. It's holy. Holy means set apart, above all, for you. So I want you to understand, the Sabbath is for you. What does that mean? It says, everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoa. Okay, well, that escalated quickly, did it not? So why is this one so serious? He says, whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. So we're all sitting here thinking like, man, I mowed my yard last Sunday. You know, it was the only day it didn't rain or whatever last week. I had to, whatever. And we're thinking, you're going to put me to death for that? Understand that God is trying to point us to something here. So keep that in mind. And what it's going to point us to is very important. That's why it's so serious. Get to verse 16. It says, therefore the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel, that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. So he's sort of pointing it back to creation, that God even rested. He set a day apart. And he's saying, listen, you need to do the same. So then we look at this and we say, okay, well, the punishment for that seems awful harsh, but what's the purpose? Well, what we understand about the story of the nation of Israel is he brought them out of the land of Egypt, where they had spent 400 years in slavery. Day in, day out, every day, all day, Saturday, Sunday, it doesn't matter what the Sabbath is. They were slaves to Pharaoh, and they worked every day, and it was hard. And they prayed for God to deliver them, and God sent them Moses, and Moses brings them out. You remember the plagues and the Passover. We looked at the Passover, and then he parted the Red Sea, God did, and they walked through it. Then they got to the mountain of God, and he showed them he gave them the 10 Commandments. He gave them this law. And we looked at how the law points us to Jesus, right? And then he says, listen, I want you to go to this promised land. You remember when God made the promise to Abraham? He says, hey, I want you to leave here, and I want you to go to a land that I will show you. Well, that land is this land that the nation of Israel was about to go into. And we pick it up in Numbers chapter 14. And they're just outside the land. They're just ready to get what God had promised them. And they decided they wanted to send some spies into the land. So they sent 12 spies, one from each tribe of each of the nations of Israel's tribes. And they go into the land. They spend 40 days in this land. And they come back and they give a report. And that's where we're going to pick it up in Numbers chapter 14, verse 1. And what happens here is basically 10 spies gave a report that the people who inhabited this land they're big, right? So they come out, they carry these grapes. They're so big that it takes 2 people to carry a cluster of grapes on their shoulders. And they come out and they said, you know what? This land is everything that God promised it to be. It's full of milk and honey, which, by the way, I heard really symbolizes cows and bees. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But he says, listen, this is everything that God said about this land is true. It's everything he said it would be. But 10 of them said, you know what, there's a problem. The people that live there, yeah, they're big guys. And their cities, they're fortified. It's going to be a problem. 10 of them, they took a vote, basically, and 10 of them were like, no, we're not going in. And Caleb and Joshua were like, hey, God has given us this land. Let's go. Like right now, let's go. And all the people are standing around listening to this argument. This is where we pick it up in Numbers chapter 14, verse 1. It says, then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to him, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in the wilderness? They're like, listen, we could have died back there. We can die right here. We don't need to go in there to die. Verse 3, why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Now I want you to think about what they're saying here. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? So think about the choice that lays before them here. The land that God promised, that's everything that he promised it would be. It had all that they needed, milk and honey, grapes, all that you could ever want. Or we can go back to Egypt and go to work for 7 days a week, every day, all day. And what choice are they making? Rather than trusting God to give us this land, we would just as soon go back and work every day and be a slave. This is the choice that lays before them. Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. So what they're choosing here is not God. And see, ultimately, this is what sin is. This is what lack of faith leads to us, is we choose things that are not God. Sometimes we look at what God has promised and we say, you know what, that's hard. God's going to have to do a miracle for us to go into this land and defeat these people. But instead of trusting God, we want to trust ourselves and look at it and say, yeah, we can't beat them. Let's just go back. And see, this is what sin is. And this is the decision that they have to make. Look at verse 5. It says, then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the people of Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, verse 7, and said to all the congregation of the people of Israel, the land which we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. If God delights in us, if we put our faith in God and his word, he will delight in us and he will give us this land. But they're going to choose otherwise. Ultimately, they make the wrong choice. This is why the Israelites wander in the wilderness for 40 years, is because of this decision. Everyone over the age of 20 from this point on never makes it to the promised land except for Caleb and Joshua. who were the ones who were ready to go. He didn't send them back to Egypt to be slaves, but they sort of were slaves in that they're slaves to their own way. So the question comes down to, are we going to trust God and His Word or not? That's the question. People by nature, we're prone to do it our own way and trust in our own ability to do things. This is this whole problem with the Sabbath, and we look at all these things and why God has tried to let the nation of Israel trust Him. Think about manna, when He gave them manna. He said, I'm going to give it to you 6 days, but on the seventh day, if you'll trust me, you won't have to gather it. I'll provide you enough for 2 days. He's trying to teach them to trust Him. The same thing is true with the Sabbath. You don't have to work on that day. I want you to trust me. I want you to trust me. Take a rest. Do we trust what God can do? That's the question. So now, what does all this point to? Why is God taking this so seriously? Why is the nation of Israel failing? Let's go to the New Testament, Matthew chapter 11. This is sort of a part of a bigger story that's going on here. I'm not going to read all of it, but I want to sort of summarize this. But Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, this is what Jesus says. We begin to see the purpose of the Sabbath. Jesus says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. You will find rest for your soul. Now, you want to know what Exodus was pointing to? The Sabbath, taking that rest, points us to Jesus. He is the Sabbath. He gives us eternal rest. Now, how does that work? Right, the nation of Israel, they wanted to go back to Egypt and slave away and do whatever they had to do. The Jews, we talked about them earlier, how they're always trying. I got to pray 3 times a day. I got to tithe. I got to follow the law. I got to do all this. We as Christians, we think, well, I got to please God. I got to do this, or He's gonna send a lightning bolt my way. We do all these things trying to earn God's favor, and Jesus says, "Hey, take a rest." Here's what He's saying: it's not on you and your ability to do anything. This is why He says, take my yoke upon you. Now, that's not a yolk of an egg. That would be kind of odd. But a yoke is, if you've seen 2 cows pulling a plow or a wagon or whatever, the yoke is the bar that ties them together. And Jesus is saying, listen, I'm carrying the load. I've got this whole thing. You just come alongside me. I've got the weight. You just get to follow along. This is what He's saying. This is the reason He took the Sabbath so seriously in Exodus. Is what He's really trying to say is, quit trying to earn it, because you can't. You and I can earn it. Think about it. Think about just what we've done. We talk about how we've lied in our life. We've stolen. We've not honored God with our lives. We look at the 10 Commandments and we've broken most of them. We've murdered people with our mouth and our heart. And you know what? At the end of the day, we can't. No matter how hard you try, you can't. And Jesus is saying, listen, quit trying. It's not about your effort or my effort or anybody's effort other than Jesus. He gives us rest. That's what this is about. And this should be good news for us. Should it not? If you're a Christian, here's what you can do. You can go, okay. You know, if you mess up, like today, let's say you leave here, somebody cuts you off. Like I was listening to this sermon the other day that Julie was telling me about, and the pastor said, he said, I'm a nice guy, but when I drive, he goes, I'm barely saved. Okay, and I can see that. Like I felt that when he said that. But when you leave here, somebody can cut you off, and you could fail. You can rest and say, you know what? It's not about me and what I've done. It's about what Jesus Christ did for me. So we can breathe deeply. Now, we're going to go into Matthew chapter 12, but it's literally the next verse, okay? So Matthew chapter 12. It says, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." Now, you can just say that, hey, Jesus is saying, hey, I will give you rest. Come, all you who are burdened and heavy laden, and I will give you rest and put my yoke upon you. And then it just happens to follow this passage about work on the Sabbath and say, well, those two are not tied together, but you would be mistaken. Like, this is on purpose. And he's talking about how when they're walking through this field, they grab some of the grains of head and eat it. And they're like, oh, you can't do that. That's work. And they're going to get on to Jesus about this. They're like, you're doing what's unlawful. Verse 3, he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? And those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which was not lawful for him to do, or for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only the priest? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priest in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? It says, I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. He's talking about himself. Then verse 7, it says, and had you known what it means, I desire mercy and sacrifice, you would have condemned the guiltless. You would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Here's what Jesus is trying to tell these people. And he's going to tell us here in Mark in just a minute. But the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He's like, listen, this rule that you guys are trying to follow so heavily, it's made for you, not for God. It's a purpose for you to point you to something. To point you, basically, he's saying, to himself. That it's not about what you do. Mark chapter 2, verse 27, it's the parallel passage to this in Mark. It says, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is even Lord of the Sabbath. See, the Sabbath points us to Jesus. The Sabbath was made to point us to this. Yeah, there's going to be one day of week when you get to rest, but it's sort of like the Day of Atonement. We talked about the Day of Atonement, how once a year they had this day where they made atonement for sin to God for all their sins for that year, and it was to point them to that day when God made their eternal Day of Atonement. Well, the Sabbath, that once a week, was a reminder to point them to the day when God gave them true rest. Not just rest one day a week, but rest forever. That we can quit trying to earn God's favor. And this is what he's trying to point us to. So, the Sabbath is here today for us in Jesus Christ. We can rest. So we look at these rules of the Sabbath, and this is why, as Christians, we don't necessarily follow them that great, because the Sabbath was meant to point us to Jesus, and we have Jesus. Okay? Now, you probably should take a day off, and you probably should focus on God for that day. But at the end of the day, if you break the Sabbath, we're not going to stone you. But find your rest in Jesus, right? So let's go to Hebrews. The writer of Hebrews really brings this full circle to show us what's going on here. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 16. It says, for who were those who heard and yet rebelled? He's going back talking about to that day when those spies went into the land and 10 of them said, we can't do it. And 2 of them were like, we can do it. And the rest of the nation was like, we'll just go back to Egypt. We'll just soon do that. That's what he's talking about when he says rebelled. For who were those who heard and yet rebelled? Was it not all those who left Egypt led by Moses? And with whom was he provoked for 40 years? Was it not those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? Remember, anybody 20 years or older never made it in. They died right there in the wilderness. Verse 18. And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? So we see that they were unable to enter because of what? Unbelief. See, they didn't enter rest. They didn't enter the land that was fertile and was going to be easy for them because they didn't have faith. They didn't take God at his word. They didn't enter into rest. And listen, the same is true for us if we try to earn God's favor and don't just rest in the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ. That's what all this is pointing us to. Chapter 4, verse 1, it says, therefore, while the promise of entering rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listened. He's like, listen, They had the opportunity to believe in God's word, and they didn't take it. They were not unified by faith, so they missed it. They didn't get to enter God's rest. Verse 3, for we who have believed entered that rest. As he said, I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage he said, they shall not enter my rest, since therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter it because of their disobedience. What was their disobedience? They tried to do it on their own. They tried to earn God's favor. They tried to be good enough. They tried to do something to get God to benefit them instead of trusting in God and His Word. Verse 7. Again, He appoints a certain day. Remember, we talked about that Day of Atonement points to a day. The day of the Sabbath points to a day, and that day happens to be the day that Jesus Christ died on the cross. It says, today, saying through David, so long afterwards in the words already quoted, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken another day later on. So let me ask you this. For you, maybe you're here today and you've never put your trust in Jesus Christ. Today is the day. Today is the day that you can choose to follow Jesus and put your trust in Him and rest in Him. Or you can stand before God one day on your own and say, no, look at these works that I've done. I did a couple of good things over here. Well, what about that stuff over there? I don't mind that stuff. Look at this stuff over here. You can stand in front of God one day and do that. Or would you rather stand in front of God one day and say, yeah, look at all this stuff back here, but look at Jesus. He's going to stand in my place. And when God looks at you, instead of seeing all your stuff, you know what He sees? He sees Jesus. Why? Because He took on your work. He did it for you. It's the reason He had to live a righteous life. Verse 9. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from His. God rested in His work. Jesus said in Matthew 11, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Would you stand with me? I'm going to ask TC and the band to come up here. Would you put your trust in Jesus today? Would you rest in Him today? Maybe you're here and you're a Christian, and we still as Christians fall into this trap of trying to earn God's favor. You can rest to know that you can't earn it. You don't need to earn it. God loves us and cares for us. Okay? I'll finish in Hebrews chapter 10. This is what it says. It says, and every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, He sat down at the right hand of God. What does that mean He did? He rested. His work was done. Not only was His work done, your work was done. My work was done. Because we don't have anything to do. He did it all for us. Verse 13, waiting for that time until the enemies should be made a footstool for His feet. For by a single offering He has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. For you, today could be the day of salvation. You could put your faith and trust in Him. When you think about the Sabbath for us as Christians, it should point us to Jesus. Today is the Sabbath for us. Today should be a day that points us to Jesus, and we can rest in the fact and know that He did all that we couldn't do so that we can have a relationship with God. Would you pray with me? God, we come to You today, God. I feel like in some respects breathing a sigh of relief. That God, it's not about us. Thank goodness. Because we can try and we can try, but it only takes one person pulling out in front of us or one thought or one whatever for us to just feel like we failed. And God, help us to understand it's not about us. We truly miss the grace of God when we think that it's about us and our performance. It's not about our performance. It's about the performance of Jesus Christ and what He did for us. And we're so thankful for that. And God, if there's anybody here who's trying to earn God's salvation, I pray today that they just turn it over to you, to trust you and take you at your word. And maybe you're here today and man, you just look back and you say, well, there's just no way after all that I've done that God can save me. He wants to have a relationship with me. Trust me to know that God, through Jesus Christ, can pay for all that. You can rest in Jesus regardless of what you've done. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you for listening to this message today brought to you by Refuge Church. Please visit our website for more resources as well as our YouTube channel. Just search for Refuge Church in Lenoir City, Tennessee to find us. We hope that this message has helped you find hope in Jesus Christ.